Have you ever wondered what really happened after Moses' death? It wasn't just the end of a great leader, it was the beginning of a spiritual revolution that shook Israel forever. 7 shocking events exploded one after the other, changing the course of biblical history. And today you'll discover each of them and see how these same principles can still transform your life. Moses, Israel's greatest prophet, died on Mount Nebo. The Bible tells us that God himself buried him, and to this day, no one knows where. But herein lies the mystery. His mission did not die with him. It was passed on to Joshua, his spiritual successor. And just as in our own lives, when something important ends, a season, a job, a relationship, it can feel like it's all over. Yet often, it's the very moment God is opening the door to something greater. In this story, hidden in Scripture, we'll discover 7 shocking events that reveal how God's purpose never ends with the death of one man. It continues through God's promise. Moses, the man who spoke face to face with God, reached the end of his journey on Mount Nebo. Scripture tells us something astonishing. God himself buried Moses in a place no one has ever found. Think about it. Of all the great figures in history, this prophet's final resting place remains hidden, untouched by human hands. It's as if heaven seals history, reminding us that the true focus was never on the man, but on the mission God had set in motion. Why would God keep the location a secret? Perhaps to protect Israel from turning his tomb into a shrine, or worse, an idol. Human nature often clings to symbols rather than substance. We build monuments, cling to objects, cling to people, forgetting that God's purpose is greater than all of them. The Bible gives us a chilling warning here. When we obsess over the visible, we risk losing sight of God's invisible presence guiding us. Now, bring this to life. How often do we place our hope in leaders, jobs, systems, or even relationships, believing they are the center of our security? Then, suddenly, they're gone. A boss leaves, a friend drifts away, a phase of life ends, and we're left wondering if everything falls apart with them. But the mystery of Moses' burial whispers a truth. God's plan doesn't depend on a person, a place, or a structure. His promises go beyond what we can see, and this is where the suspense builds. Moses' hidden tomb wasn't the end of the story. In fact, it set the stage for one of the most shocking transitions in the Bible. Because right after this burial, God speaks again, not to the mourners, but to Joshua. And what he says next is even more stunning. For 40 years, Moses was God's voice to Israel. Through him came the 10 Commandments, the parting of the Red Sea, the daily miracle of manna, and even moments of divine judgment. His leadership defined an entire generation, shaping it in the wilderness with miracles and discipline. When he died, it was not just the passing of a leader. It was the closing of a prophetic era that carried the weight of God's presence in extraordinary ways. But endings in the Bible are never just endings. They are thresholds. Moses' death signaled a transition that many likely feared. Imagine the people. The man who had stood before Pharaoh, who had brought water from a rock, was gone. Who could wear shoes like those? Yet God was already writing a new chapter, because his promise was not tied to a man, but to a mission, to enter the promised land. This change is something we all experience in life. When a phase ends, graduation, moving to a new city, leaving behind a job or relationship, it can feel like the desert after Moses, uncertain, frightening, silent. But like Israel, we are reminded that endings are often beginnings in disguise. What feels like loss can actually be preparation for advancement. God closes doors not to imprison us, but to guide us toward those we were always destined to pass through. And herein lies the tension. If the end of Moses' life seemed like the end of everything, what God did next completely shattered that fear. For he did not allow Israel to wander off or wander in confusion. Instead, he spoke directly and urgently to Joshua. And this message not only comforted him, it carried the shock of divine authority that would change the destiny of an entire nation. There was no long funeral, no prolonged period of mourning, no committee meeting to decide who should lead. Shortly after Moses' death, the Bible says that God himself spoke directly to Joshua. Imagine the shock, the silence of grief suddenly interrupted by the voice of the Almighty, transferring authority without delay. It was as if heaven were saying, "The mission doesn't stop. My promise doesn't stop." This is powerful because leadership transitions, in human terms, often take time. But here, there is no hesitation. God makes it clear. "As I was with Moses, so I will be with you." This declaration alone carried more weight than any crown, title, or ceremony. Joshua needed no vows or human approval. He had a divine appointment. And this serves as a reminder. When God calls us, he doesn't wait for others to validate it. His word is enough. Think about how this connects to real life. Sometimes we're thrust into new responsibilities we didn't anticipate. A parent dies, and suddenly we're caring for the family. A leader steps aside, and suddenly we're the ones making the decisions. We're not given a manual or a grace period, just the weight of responsibility and the quiet whisper that God is with us. This is exactly what Joshua faced. A mission so great it seemed impossible, yet supported by God's presence. And this is where the story intensifies. God's message to Joshua wasn't just a pat on the back or gentle encouragement. It was a call to the impossible. Because the land ahead wasn't empty. It was teeming with fortified cities, armies, and enemies far stronger than Israel. And what God tells Joshua next raises the stakes even further. The first words God gives Joshua are not strategies, maps, or battle plans. Instead, he promises his presence. "As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will never leave you nor forsake you." This is profound. God knew that Joshua's greatest need wasn't tactics, it was security. Before confronting armies and walls, he needed to know one thing, that the God of miracles was still with him. But then came the impossible task. Joshua was commanded to lead a nation into the Promised Land, a place filled with fortified cities, powerful kings, and warriors far stronger than the wandering tribes of Israel. To human eyes, it was madness. Imagine standing before the imposing walls of Jericho, knowing you had no siege weapons, no trained army, no logical chance. Yet God's command was simple: be strong and courageous. The impossible mission was not limited to human capacity, but to divine presence. This reflects much of our own lives. How often do we face challenges that seem far beyond our capabilities? Starting over after a loss, starting a business with limited resources, forgiving when it seems unbearable, all of these can seem impossible. But, like Joshua, we are reminded that God doesn't always remove the challenge. He intervenes with us. The true miracle is not that the task becomes easier, but that his presence transforms our courage in the face of the impossible. And here's the twist. As God gave Joshua this overwhelming mission, the people watched closely. Would they follow him? Would they trust him as they had trusted Moses? What happened next shocked everyone, because the nation's reaction revealed a radical shift that set the stage for victory. Until that point, Israel's history had been marked by rebellion. They questioned Moses countless times, resisted his leadership, and even longed to return to Egypt when times got tough. But something changed after his death. When Joshua spoke up, the people responded with unexpected unity. "We will do everything you command us, and wherever you send us, we will go." This radical loyalty must have left Joshua perplexed. Why the sudden change? The new generation had grown up seeing the consequences of disobedience. They had seen their parents wander and die in the wilderness because they doubted God's promise. Now, on the brink of the Promised Land, they were determined not to repeat the same mistakes. Sometimes, pain becomes the teacher that obedience never was. Israel had learned the hard way, and now, loyalty to God's chosen leader was the only path forward. This is a lesson that resonates deeply today. Teams, families, and even churches often fracture when pride and rebellion take over. But when a group unites around God's purpose, something powerful happens. The impossible begins to seem possible. Think of times in your life when division blocked progress, in contrast to times when unity brought breakthroughs. Israel's radical loyalty to Joshua wasn't about the man himself, it was about trusting that God was with him. And this loyalty was soon put to the ultimate test. For before they could even face their first battle, God performed a miracle that echoed Israel's past and confirmed Joshua's calling. The next event was not merely symbolic, it was supernatural. The Jordan River, a fierce barrier before the Promised Land, was about to do something unthinkable. Just when Joshua needed confirmation of his calling, God answered. The Jordan River was the final barrier between Israel and the Promised Land. At the time of the flood, its waters were turbulent and impossible to cross, but God instructed the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant to enter the river first. No bridge, no raft, just faith. And when their feet touched the edge, the waters stopped flowing and pooled upstream. The nation crossed on dry ground. It wasn't just a miracle, it was a declaration. Just as God had parted the Red Sea for Moses, he now parted the Jordan for Joshua. This validated Joshua as the chosen leader, leaving no doubt that God's presence had transferred seamlessly from one servant to the next. Imagine being there, the roar of the waters silenced, the muddy riverbed suddenly dry, and the ark making way for the promise. But this miracle also brought a deeper lesson. The water didn't move until the priests moved first. Faith before evidence, action before certainty. It's a principle that still confronts us today. Doors often remain closed until we take the first step of trust, whether following a calling, forgiving someone, or entering an unknown phase. Sometimes God asks us to get our feet wet before he parts the waters. And just when it seemed that miracles were confirming Joshua's path, the story took an even stranger turn. For in the shadow of Jericho's imposing walls, Joshua encountered a mysterious figure, a warrior unlike any he had ever seen, and what followed would shake his understanding of who was truly in command of the battle that awaited him. As Joshua prepared for the greatest battle of his life, the siege of Jericho, he was likely calculating strategies, scouting the walls, and wondering how an unprepared army could prevail. But then, something extraordinary happened. The Bible tells us that Joshua looked up and saw a man standing before him with his sword drawn. Instinctively, Joshua asked the obvious question, "Are you for us or for our enemies?" The answer shattered his expectations. The figure replied, "Neither, but as commander of the Lord's army, I have now come." This was no ordinary warrior. Many scholars believe it was a theophany, a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ himself. In that moment, Joshua learned that the real question was not whether God was on his side, but whether Joshua was on God's side. The presence of the heavenly commander revealed a deeper truth. The battle belonged to the Lord, not to human strategy. Think how humbling this must have been. Joshua, the newly appointed leader, about to prove his worth before the entire nation, suddenly realized the fight wasn't about his leadership. How often do we face challenges thinking everything depends on us, on our strength, our intelligence, our plan, only to be reminded that victory comes from surrendering to God's will? The heavenly commander's sword was a reminder that heaven fights its own battles and that we are simply called to align ourselves with divine purpose. And just when Joshua thought the miraculous encounters couldn't get any more disturbing, God orchestrated another shock. This time, not with an appearance, but with an absence. Because the manna, that daily miracle that had sustained Israel for 40 years, suddenly stopped. And what this meant for the people was nothing short of revolutionary. For 40 years, Israel awoke every morning to a miracle. Manna covered the ground like dew, a daily reminder that God was providing, even in the wilderness. But the very moment they stepped into the Promised Land and ate its produce, the manna stopped. And so, The miraculous food supply they depended on disappeared. At first glance, it may have seemed like a loss, but in reality, it was a promotion. Why? Because manna was food for survival. It was provision for the wilderness, not abundance for the promise. By taking it away, God was saying, "You no longer
live from
need
the richness
miracles
of the land
I
I have
have given you." It was a shift from dependence to maturity, from almsgiving to harvest. Sometimes God interrupts yesterday's miracles because He invites us to take on today's responsibilities. We experience this too. Perhaps a door closes, a season of easy provision ends, or a support system is removed. At first, it feels like abandonment, but often it's God preparing us for growth. Like a parent removing the training wheels, He stops doing for us what He knows we are now ready to do with Him. The cessation of manna wasn't a punishment. It was preparation for a new life in the Promised Land. And yet, just as Israel was adapting to this new way of life, God issued a command that made no sense from a military perspective. On the eve of battle, instead of sharpening swords, He ordered the men to undergo circumcision, a measure that temporarily weakened the entire army. What could have possibly motivated such a risky order? The answer reveals another shocking truth about God's victory. On the eve of their first major battle in the Promised Land, Israel expected preparation to mean weapons, strategy, and strength. Instead, God gave Joshua a shocking command. Every male born in the wilderness was to be circumcised. Militarily, it made no sense. The act left the entire fighting force weak and vulnerable for days. But God wasn't preparing them for war with swords. He was preparing them for war with a covenant. This was more than a physical act. It was a spiritual declaration. Victory does not come from numbers, weapons, or tactics, but from being aligned with God's covenant. By submitting to circumcision, the people were declaring that their trust was not in their own ability, but in God's promise. It was a reminder that battles are won in the heart before they are won on the field. Consider how this translates into life today. Sometimes God asks us to do something that seems backward, even risky. He calls us to stop when we want to run, to surrender when we want to fight, to forgive when we want to retaliate. It seems like weakness, but in reality, it is preparation. True strength comes from obedience, not resistance. Israel's circumcision before battle reminds us that consecration always precedes victory. And just when this moment of surrender seemed like the final step in their preparation, God gave them one final command, one that would ensure the memory of His miracles would never fade. For before facing the walls of Jericho, He commanded the people to build a memorial with stones from the Jordan. And the reason for this carried a truth that still echoes through the generations. After the Jordan River parted and the nation crossed on dry ground, God gave Joshua a final and unexpected command. He commanded 12 men, one from each tribe, to take stones from the middle of the river and place them as a memorial. At first, it may have seemed like a small, symbolic gesture, but in reality, it was a prophetic act. A way of ensuring that the miracle of the Jordan crossing would never be forgotten. The memorial wasn't for the generation that had just passed, it was for their children and grandchildren. Whenever future generations saw those stones, they would ask, "What do these mean?" And the story of God's power, faithfulness, and presence would be told again. Memory became testimony. The stones were not just rocks, they were anchors of faith, planted in history to keep Israel rooted in the truth of what God had done. This principle is equally powerful today. We build our own memorials in different ways: journals, photographs, testimonies, and even scars that remind us of where God has brought us. They are not just reminders of the past, they are fuel for the future. When we face new battles, we can look back at these milestones and know the same God who opened rivers before can do so again. And this brings us to the greatest revelation of all, Moses. Death was never the end. It was the beginning of a divine transition, marked by mystery, obedience, miracles, consecration, and memory. Each shocking event was not random, but a stepping stone toward God's
And what this
greater
means for us
purpose.
today
Is both challenging and deeply inspiring. Moses' death seemed to be the end of everything. But as we have seen, it was actually the spark that set off a chain of divine shocks. God's secret burial of his servant, the end of one prophetic era and the beginning of another. Joshua's impossible mission, the people's radical loyalty, the parting of the Jordan River, the appearance of the heavenly commander, the cessation of the manna, the consecration by circumcision, and the memorial of the stones. Each event carried a truth. God's purpose never dies with a man. It lives on through his promise, and perhaps that's the message for you today. You may be at the end of a season, mourning a loss, or facing a transition that feels overwhelming. But what feels like the end may actually be God's invitation to enter into something greater. Just as Israel discovered, his presence isn't buried in the past. It walks with us into the future. Think about it. Doors close, but new ones open. Provisions end, but new ones emerge. Leaders fall, but God's purpose endures. This isn't just biblical history. It's a living revelation for anyone experiencing change right now. The Bible isn't simply telling us what happened. It's whispering what can happen in our own lives if we dare to trust in God's invisible hand. So let me leave you with a question. Which of these 7 shocking events touched your heart the most today? And do you believe that what God did for Israel, he can still do in your life? Because the same God who led them through the Jordan is still writing stories of faith, courage, and resilience today. If you love discovering these hidden truths of the Bible, don't stop here. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell, as more shocking revelations will be coming soon. But before I go, I want to hear your thoughts. Which of these events after Moses' death shocked you the most, and why? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Your thoughts might inspire someone else going through a transition, because the Bible is not just history, it is a living revelation, and together we are discovering the secrets hidden within its pages.